off-world colony. The chance to begin again in a golden land of opportunity and adventure.
Racial is an experiment, nothing more. Commerce is our goal here in Tyrell. More human than human is our motto. If we gift the past, we create a cushion, a pillow for emotions, and consequently we can control them.
So I've got another really fun tutorial to go through today. I'm going to be breaking apart my process of creating samples and sound effects for a track or a project. Now I'm going to be doing a little bit in Logic, and I've got a few bits of hardware I'm going to throw in, and then I've very recently bought an EMU E5000 Ultra, which is an old vintage sampler, and I'm going to do a little bit in there, and then at the end I'm going to go through my track in Renoise. So lots to look forward to hopefully in this tutorial. So a great place to start when creating specific sounds and effects for a project is actually to set a theme or vibe for the track. This can be as simple as referencing another artist or a particular style, such as LTJ Bookham and making a liquid rolling jungle track. Another great place to start for a theme is to get inspired by a movie or a TV show, and for this project I was actually watching the old Blade Runner movie from 1982 with Harrison Ford. I love the sound effects and the soundtrack that was actually created by Vangelis, who is this amazing Greek composer who very sadly passed away quite recently, but he was probably best known for Chariots of Fire, but the soundtrack's really epic to this old Blade Runner movie. And this is how the birth of this idea really happened and this project. So one thing I quickly want to say at this stage is I've also made a sample pack again for this project. This has got lots of nice sci-fi effects and drum breaks and bass noises and lots of nice pads and stuff in there. And everything you hear in my project and in this tutorial is going to be in that pack. So if you want to support my channel, that'd be amazing. I've also got a free sample pack up there with all the stuff I took from the Blade Runner movie and a few other things that I can't sell on my website. So to start this sound design process, I really love making pads and atmospheres, and I'm really trying to find a couple of central pads I can use for my project that I really like. And Pull Stretch is an amazing tool to do this, and it does just what it says on the tin. It stretches the audio out, but it's got a really lovely algorithm. And what I love to chuck in here is just chops of records, and you can throw anything in and get great results like percussion hits, but I particularly love chucking in little chunks of other records. And so in my sample manager called Audio Finder, I have loads of different, some of these I've taken from Reddit and some I've done myself, but lots of different chops of audio. And I've got this song here by Isaac Hayes. And for me, this just felt like it'd be something that might sound really good if I threw it into Pull Stretch. And it's only really experimentation that's going to show you what's going to sound good or not. And yeah, it's just a fun process of throwing things in and seeing what comes out. So I can just drag this in, and I'm not really messing too much with all these controls. I really like just using the stretch amount, and I go somewhere around 10 is usually a good place to start. Otherwise you get super long audio files. Some really nice tones in this one, and so I just go through the process. I'll render these out. Logic doesn't do 32-bit floating, so I go down to 24-bit, and then I'll just render and go through a whole bunch of samples like this and create a nice folder of nice pad sounds. Now what I then do is come into Logic, and I just do a little bit more processing on the sounds. This is mainly to cover up some of the digital artifacts that will obviously be inherent of using time stretching in this way. So if I go to another example here, I've got this really long pad which I've taken, and it just has loads of lovely moments in the stretching. To me, they almost sound like individual pads in their own right, and so what I'll go and do is chop up this whole long section and create lots of individual different pads from one long stretched sequence from Pull Stretch. This one, I think I've driven it a little bit for some saturation, and then I've completely covered it in reverb. So you just get so many lovely tones, and I think the general idea here is I'm taking those record cuts, chucking them into Pull Stretch to stretch them, and then I'm using reverb and filters and a bit of saturation just to smooth out some of the digital artifacts. Once I finished creating all the pads and the atmospheres in Logic and Pull Stretch, I wanted to create a melody or a lead sound, and I've really been trying to incorporate the EMU into my production now, and I've been absolutely loving it. It's such a cool device. So I went about creating this nice sustained lead sound in there, and I'm going to walk you through that process now. So firstly, to make my life easy, I use this MIDI send and receive device called MIDI pipe, and it's really easy. This is just sending out of my audio interface through a MIDI cable, and then that goes into the back of the EMU. And I have a little preset here where I can see I'm sending my keyboard into, this is just allowing me to say which messages I want to send, and then it's going out into my audio interface, and then that's going into the EMU. But this essentially means I can use my MIDI keyboard to play in the EMU. Okay, cool. So what I've got is I've got a single note that I've taken out of my Digitone, and I just want to run it through the EMU and crunch it up a bit and put it through some of the effects and just turn it into a really nice usable patch that I can use later in my project. So the first thing I've got to do is actually come to manage, and I want to create a new instrument here, and I'm just going to go and increase the recording time to about 10 seconds, and then I'm getting ready to press ARM, and then I'm actually just going to trigger the sample from Twisted Wave in my DAW. Cool, so that was a nice long sample, and how I've got it set up is that everything that goes out of my audio interface goes to my mixer, and it also goes to the EMU out of its second output, so that makes it really easy to chuck stuff in here. So I'm going to keep this sample, and then we can go edit. So now got the sample there. Now the first thing I want to do is crunch it up a bit, so I'm going to come into Tools, and I'm going to go into Sample Rate Convert and just lower this. And I love this crunchy filter here, and somewhere around 20,000 usually works really well for me. So let's hit that. Cool. So now we've crunched it up a bit, let's go and start editing this preset. And the first thing to do is actually just to make sure it's selected in this voice section here. So we've got that nicely selected, and then I'm going to go across, and then I want to edit the voice, and I want to go next to the amp page, and the amp envelope, ADSR envelope page is quite weird on the EMU, but to get the release going and to turn it up, I'm just going to jack up this control here, and now when I trigger the sample, it rings out a lot nicer and a lot more naturally. So the next thing I'm actually going to do is to come across, and I'm going to put this filter on it. So we're going to put and I really like the filters on the EMU. So I'm going to pull that right down, and I'm then going into this chord section, and this is essentially the modulation section in the EMU. And I'm just going to try and find filter frequency, and this is so I can assign the filter cutoff to my mod wheel. Perfect. And then I've got to turn up the amount, and hopefully this is going to mean now when I play my MIDI keyboard, if I go somewhere around 70%, that it's actually going to trigger properly. Okay, cool. So now you can see when I turn up my mod wheel, I've got access to the filter cutoff in the EMU. But what I really want to do is start pitching down this sample. I recorded it at quite a high pitch, but if I pitch it down in the EMU, especially after I've done the sample rate conversion, it just adds a lovely low end to the sample that sometimes wasn't even there. It's some of that analog warmth that people always talk about is what you get. Like the bass is sounding so nice, and I'm sure whenever I pitch this, I've taken this sample from my Digitone, but it doesn't have any of that lovely warm bass in it when you pitch that sample down in the Digitone. So it does show how good this algorithm is, the pitching algorithm is in the old EMU samplers. Okay, so it's sounding cool there. Maybe I went a little bit too high with the amount on the filter. And what I'm also going to do is just run this through some of the effects. If I come back to tuning in the EMU, I can run this through a chorus here. So if I just turn this up to maybe sort of 30% chorusing. Giving it some nice stereo spread. And one thing that also sounds really good is this glide amount. So if I just put a bit of glide on it, and I use this a lot in this to making some of the leads for this track, just to give them that slightly eerie feeling. It makes it instantly sound a lot more Stranger Things by adding a bit of glide, and the glide in the EMU is sounding great as well. So I've just got some basic things happening here, and really the key to this is having this filter cutoff going, and then actually just having a really long release time. Really just helps let the notes ring out a lot more naturally. And one other thing I can do then is actually come and just apply some master effects in the EMU. So I've got this reverb I could put on. If I also go to the next one, I've got a chorus on here. We could put maybe a delay on somewhere. We've got a delay in here, stereo delay. Delay time, let's go 500 milliseconds. It's quite a good lead sort of delay time. And try and send it there as well. Sounding quite nice, bit more feedback. Really nice, and just running it through those effects and those few little touches in the EMU takes a very basic, that was just one note played out of the Digitone, which is a sort of soft, in between maybe a saw wave and a triangle wave or a sine wave, just with a few harmonics in it. And the EMU, especially when you go down low, just sounds really great and fat and warm. Cool, so we've got the pads down and we've got some lead sounds going on in the EMU, and we've stored that all up for using later. And it would be foolish to attempt to do a Blade Runner inspired track without doing some cool sci-fi style sound effects. Now the first way I'm going to show you here in Logic is actually about abusing plugins, and I've used this plugin a few times and I notice it does some really weird things when you change some of the parameters before you trigger a sample, and I thought that I might just get some really interesting results by recording the output of Logic and then messing with this plugin. So this plugin I'm going to use today is called Other Desert Cities. And it's absolutely wild. It's a delay plugin that you can turn into a reverb by turning up this diffusion. But anyway, what I notice is whenever I trigger it, so that's acting normally as the delay should sound. But when I start messing with these time parameters, I get some absolutely crazy effects, and sometimes they're just on one side of the audio. So what I'll quite often do is just take one side and see if I find things that I like, and I can turn this one up maybe. Oh, you see that one there? I think maybe these are a bit too close together, so I can really capture the sounds, but maybe this one? Yeah, in here, look. And then so I'll take this one bit of audio and cut that away. Maybe I want to fade in. Cool, and let's put a little fade out as well. And that's a really cool sci-fi robots gritty effect. Anyway, I'm not sure of other plugins that can do this. I know there'll be lots out there, especially delay plugins where you're changing the time, or reverb plugins where you're changing the decay time. You're going to get similar sounding effects. Wicked. So another thing I love to do is use this time stretch effects instrument I created, and you can also grab this on my website, but it is super handy. You can essentially just open this instrument and then copy any sample in, and then all you got to do is just trigger it in Renoise. Okay, and I'm just going to create a little loop happening here so I can keep re-triggering it. What I can then do is come to this phrases, and then I'm just going to mess with the pitch here and the lines per beat. But what I actually quite like to do is to come to the modulation panel and then go pitch and macro and assign pitch to a macro, and then let's call this pitch, and then I can go and put the pitch range up to something really high like 50, and so this is going to change the pitch a lot now. And then I can come back to where I want, into the phrase. I'm just going to assign that pitch to one of the faders here. Cool. So that should be in now. Cool. So I can now use my MIDI controller to change pitch, and then I can use my mouse to change the lines per beat. So this bass sample is sounding absolutely bananas, but if I chuck in something like a drum hit, might be a bit better. Maybe we go and chuck in like a little sequence from the break. And let's just re-trigger this a little bit longer. Forwards loop. Cool, let's do that. And so I'm just going to get Twisted Wave again and start to record everything that comes out of Renoise. Cool, so I've done a whole big recording there, and stupidly when I was doing this example I actually only recorded the left side of the audio, so that was just a mistake I made in this recording stage, but I can still just convert this to mono and this would still be usable. And I would just go through and just pick out, that to me is pretty cool, and I can just export that into this file. And I would just go through and just find things. I can actually just export straight from here and just keep going. And you'll find so many crazy things. I just chucked a drum break in there, but you can use any source and you'll get completely crazy different things from every source you chuck into. But drums sound great to me, and you get loads of variation just from chucking like a chop of a drum break in. Wicked, so I'm not going to do a whole tutorial on the Digitone, and I'm actually a bit rusty, but I've made this patch in the past, and I think what it's really doing is just modulating the pitch. I'm using a random wave here, and which is very subtly modulating the pitch, and then I'm also modulating, by the looks of it, the ratio of B, and this is weird FM stuff, but it's essentially just giving me different tones every time. But I realized when I started to whack around this this pitch depth, it gave me really cool robot effects, and this has got loads of delay on, but if I take the delay way down and take the reverb down, make it a bit more usable for another project. Sounds just like R2-D2 to me. And I've figured if I just change the BPM multiplier, you get all this. It's basically just doing like a random pitch at every It's kind of a sine-like sound that's doing a random pitch, and I can control. Bit more reverb. Anyway, I ended up messing with this for ages and just taking all the best robot style sounds from this patch. But I also thought with this patch, because if I take this pitch away, the tone is actually quite nice and pleasant. I thought if I actually put something a bit more dissonant into the algorithm, into the FM, and then run it through the same kind of modulation, I might get some really interesting tones. So I made this other one that's a bit more of like a harsh robot effect. Which is giving me like the kind of mechanical sounds of a robot rather than the talking sounds of the robot, and I merged them all together. And then you can really create, when you come to the sound design process later, you've got all the machine noises and the talking noises, and this might have been a better process to go through for actually sound designing for a movie or for a film, but I think it's really cool to show, and I did include lots of these little sounds in the background and in the breakdowns of my track. After my last project on Photek, the one thing I really struggled with to emulate in his style was his amazing drum rolls, and I've been down a massive rabbit hole trying to figure out some of the nuances of getting these advanced drum rolls down, and I'm going to take you through a few things you can do in Renoise to create drum rolls and kind of go from the basics of creating drum rolls and then show you something quite advanced later on the Digitakt. So hopefully this will be a nice little comprehensive segment on how to create super dope drum rolls in your tracks, and this really applies to drum and bass and breakbeat, but you can take this wherever you want it. So in Renoise there's a few ways to create drum rolls, and we have a basic note roll which I've got going on here, and if I just play this little segment quickly you can hear what's going on. I've just got a drum break fill coming in here. So to create this drum roll I've literally just taken, this is re-triggering a snare from that instrument, and then I've done a volume roll here as well. So the way to create these is you just put an 8 at the start, and the 8's going to be the max level of volume, and then I didn't want it to go to nothing, so I put a 3 at the bottom, and then I can use Command I and interpolate, and that's going to give me a fade of the volume going down as the roll continues. But what I also wanted to do here was create a 30-second note roll at the end, and because I'm working at 4 lines per beat, each line is a 16th note, so I can't actually just put in a 30-second note, but what I can do is delay a 16th note by half, and half hexadecimal is 80, and by delaying a 16th note by half I can create a 30-second note. So that's what I've done in this column here, and so you can put 2 notes on the same line but delay one of them by half, and then you'll get this nice roll of a 30-second note, and I can offset these as well, and so I know that 4 is sort of a quarter, and you can create lots of cool effects there. So I'm generally using 4, C and 8, and you can create really cool little offsetted roll effects, but you can play with the delay times and fine tune them as you like. So as well as being able to do standard note rolls, we can also use the re-trigger command in Renoise, and here you just put R in on the note, and then I can re-trigger the note over and over again, and the first number is the volume factor and the second number is the re-trigger length. So a higher number in the second column is going to give me sort of a 16th note repeat, and then a quicker number is going to give me a much faster note value of a repeat. So that's getting up to like a 30-second note, or even maybe like a 64th note repeat. Anyway, I find the re-trigger command a little bit hard to use to really fine tune it, and it might be great for breakcore and things like that, but in drum and bass I just want a little bit more control, I guess, over my re-triggers. What I love to do is these looping rolls, and the way to do this is actually to take your snare. So if I go to the drum break here and I want to take this snare, I can command and double click in this area, and that's the snare. So I can copy that, copy it to a new track and paste it in, and now I've just got the snare on its own track. And then I can create a forwards loop. So now when I trigger it, I've got this nice loop. But we can take this to another level, and if I go to the instrument I've created here, what I've done is I've pulled in this end time, and if you look at this ruler at the top here, you can right click in this area and you can select beats. And I've only discovered this quite recently, but it's so handy for doing these note repeats, because I can see if I've got this hitting around 1, it's going to be a perfect 16th loop or a 16th loop or 30-second note loop. And I've also combined this with some modulation I'll get into in a second, but you can really see just focusing on this ruler at the top by setting it to beats. And if I want to go, say, up to like hitting it exactly at 2, it really times it really well to your track, and you can just use this ruler to really create some cool effects here. But yeah, the great thing about using the looping snare trick is that you can use amp and filter modulation, and because you're only actually triggering the note once, it's not going to keep re-triggering the modulation. So you can just hit the note once here, and then it's going to play for the length of this modulation. And so I'm doing quite a simple volume fade, and then I've got I'm using an envelope on the cutoff, and you can really fine tune this to your track. And you can even do things like go in and come back out. So one thing I really want to be able to do in Renoise is actually modulate this sample endpoint to make it do something like this. Now you can't really do this natively. What you can do is the trick I've been showing this whole time, is actually just resample into an audio editor, and then take all these chops back out and just trigger them as samples. And that's definitely a very cool technique. But I have this device by Electron called the Digitakt, and I love Electron. They make such amazing products, but the Digitakt allows you to modulate these sample endpoints. And so I'm going to just show you quickly in here this kind of really advanced snare roll technique for getting really nicely fine-tuned snare rolls. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take you through creating this advanced snare roll in the Digitakt. Now, I have this drum break here, and this is actually starting on a snare. Now, the first thing I want to do is actually set the loop to be a forwards loop. And then I want to pull in this loop length. And we can start to create the snare rolls the way we did on the Digitakt. Now we can control the amp from this page. And control how long these snares are going to ring out. And then also we can do a little bit of filtering. Maybe like this. So I'm getting this nice and then what I'm actually going to do is come into this LFO page, and one thing I really like to do is if I come on here and I actually go and find loop length again, sample length even, which is the same parameter that I'm using to change the speed of the roll, and I'm going to take my speed down of my BPM and just turn a square wave on, and then I'm going to trigger it, but I'm going to trigger it with this half wave. And if I just offset the phase, I just want it to be right at the top. And what I'm essentially going to do is just use this this parameter to modulate the I just find the resolution is maybe a bit better in this LFO page, and it's just a bit easier for me to modulate and to find good times, and it saves me having to swap back always to this page to change the length amount. But another thing you can do is actually to start changing, say, the volume. If I do a random wave on the volume and do a really subtle one here, that's really obvious. So using some random amplitude modulation is really cool to make every snare hit a little bit different. And we can apply the same thing. You could do this with pitch as well, and apply some subtle pitch modulation as well. That's really crazy. And a bit quicker. And just something really subtle like 10. I want to go to 10. Another thing I really like to do is to do this ramping one. So on this loop length, and this is what I really want to be able to do in Renoise, but I can't, is I can use this ramping waveform. And if I offset the phase, I can have, essentially, it's going to start at nothing. It's going to start exactly at what the depth is set at. Sorry, it's going to start exactly what the length is set at. But then as it rises, it's going to change. And so you can control, with the speed, is going to control how long it stays at nothing for before it starts to ramp. So you can have it go start really quick and then slow down. So this is a really cool effect, and you know, you've really messing with sample tune. You can have a pitch tune, so I could copy the ramping waveform as well. From the previous idea there, and then I'm using this half trig I really like to use for this waveform, and offset the phase, and so we want a bit more. You see the speed's a bit quick. Really cool pitching. It's starting nice and even, and then it's pitching down, and you can take this as far as you want. But the ramping wave on this half trig, so it's only triggering half of the ramp, so it never gets to this stage where it resets. It just sort of triggers and it stays at this decreasing value. Now, one thing I did for this project, and to get these right, especially if you're resampling, is I actually did this in the context of a drum break. So I just had this 1-bar loop, and then I was testing all these different values as the loop's playing. So I love the timing of that roll, and I don't think I would have figured something like this out using note repeats or even re-trigger. Is like, I don't know what timing this is hitting, whether it's triplets or it's just like slightly off 16th, but it's sounding really nice in the context of this song and this drum break. So what I would do from the Digitakt is carry on with this same technique that I'm always doing and just resample that hit out. And so now I've got that hit done, and I can just keep going and working and finding other things. That's cool as well. It's like a little bit stuttered, so just hit record again. And this is my whole process of sound design, is creating loads of cool samples for my project later. And if I want to go and find a dope drum roll, I don't have to go and make it. It's all there ready to go. Right, so now we've got all of these sound design elements put together. We've got the pads and the Atmos, we've got the leads from the EMU, the robot effects from the Digitone, and then I've got more effects of the Digitakt and all those drum rolls. And then I've also created loads of drum breaks and those kick and snare variations I showed you how to do in the Photech tutorial. So there's just so much preparation that's gone into making this track in the sound design stage, and that means when I actually get to start producing, I've got absolutely everything I need in this sample pack, this custom made sample pack, ready to go for the project. So now let's jump into Renoise. I just want to show you a few little tips and tricks I got up to when I was making this track. Okay, so I think the most obvious place to start will be the drums, and the way I've got all the grouping set up here is a little bit crazy, but the general idea is I'm using some of the same breaks twice, but because I'm combining them in different ways and layering them in different ways, I've got to then group them in different ways as well. And this is really easy to do in other DAWs, and it is easy to do in Renoise, but it does look a little bit confusing on my screen here. But I've collapsed lots of the stuff to hopefully make it a little bit more manageable. So in the beginning, I'm actually using this break I used in the Digitakt, and I've got a nice little roll which is kind of leading me. So I've got a few snare hits from this break, which I'm just triggering, and then it's triggering one of those nice rolls that I made, and I'm actually triggering one roll, and then I'm hitting another roll as well, to create a really cool little effect to just lead me into the drums right in the beginning. So if I just show you this little passage very briefly.
The chance to begin again in a golden land of opportunity and adventure.
So I'm using the sample offset command here to trigger this break. That's actually mainly because I really couldn't be bothered to slice it all up again, and so I'm just using that command to be a bit lazy and to just re-trigger that pattern and to make it something satisfying that I like to use. But I've used this Digitakt pattern here, and I've also used it later on down here, but I've had to change where it is. So you can hear for this passage it's sounding quite full and like punchy, even though it's the intro section. I wanted it to sort of get rolling straight away. But actually in this next section, I actually wanted to change the processing. I was leading into a break here, and I wanted to strip the drums back a little bit and have them filtering out. And I think I'm using decimal to do this. And I'm lowering the sample rate, and I'm also using a high pass filter and just taking some of the low end out. Sounding it more crunchy and just less fat if I go and compare it to this one. So this is how it's sounding in this section, and then I take it here and really thinned it out. What I'm also doing at this point, I think, up here is I'm triggering a whole load of effects to come on, and I showed a lot of this in my last tutorial, but I do this all the time where I'm just right clicking in Renoise, and you can see when it hits this line, the flange is turning on, the filter's turning on, everything's coming to life in this section that's leading me into the drop. And I'm also, what I'm doing is hitting an LFO, and what I've done is I've right click reset, and you can see that 5800 there, and that means when it hits the start of this line, it's going to reset this LFO, and this LFO is set on a custom one-shot LFO, and it's going to the digital filters cutoff, and if you look, it's just going to slowly roll off this cutoff following this envelope shape. So if I play this little section, you can hear all the drums start to thin out even more as we get to the breakdown.
Rachel is an experiment, nothing more. Cars.
And what I've also done here is hit a delay effect. Maybe it's at the start of the chain. Here we go. So I've got this delay effect here that I then turn on as well to trigger the ringing out of the delay. It's got a really high feedback and rate, and so it rings out for ages, but because it comes after I've stripped all the frequencies out, it doesn't actually clash with anything too much, and it really helps lead you into the drop and the breakdown as this the snares just ring out for ages, the delayed snares ring out for ages.
Rachel is an experiment, nothing more. Cars is our goal here in Tyrell. More human than human is our motto.
If we gift them
In this drop section, I had those nice rolling drums in the beginning, and then I want to go into some of that more photech-y style drums. I was really tried to perfecting this drum technique. You can see I've done a very basic drum roll here from this main break, and then I have this silence and this crazy effect comes in, and then everything sort of stops, and then it comes into this really hard bass, and stripped back it's just like the bass and the drums. But if you listen to the drums here, okay, so I think this section here kind of demonstrates me using all those different snare variations and kick variations a lot. I've got this little rolling break happening in the background, and I think I'm following quite a similar pattern to what I'm doing in my main one. So it's not doing too much there, it's just filling out the space a little bit, and then I've got this main break that's really doing all the work here. So yeah, I think everything's sounding quite fat and tight with these drums, and it's rolling around really nicely. I definitely programmed some shuffle into the drums when I made the original breaks. So even though all these hits are perfectly quantized, there will be bits of shuffle happening from just how I made the breaks in the first place. I've really tried to go into all these different sections, so every time I'm hitting a new phrase, something new is happening with my drums. And this might be layering or just changing the pattern of the drum hits that are happening, but I'm also constantly switching to different breaks and just trying to keep things really interesting with how the drums are happening. I'm like launching into a break which has got a completely different tone, and it's quite metallic to me, and like upper mid-rangey sound, and I think I've smashed it quite hard in decimal as well. So I've really whacked it into with this preamp. I think I'm just gaining up loads and just saturating it a lot, but then by putting this other break underneath it, which is really solid and tight and not too saturated or distorted at all, I think they just balance out against each other quite nicely. So lots of cool drum stuff happening here, and I'm really proud of these drums, but it does take a really long time to get the patterns rolling around nicely and everything syncing together. And if I just show you my session timer tracker, it's taken me 26 hours so far I've been working on this project. So this stuff doesn't come easily to anyone, I think, and I really learned that from the Photech tutorials, that he would just put so much time into making his tracks. It's really like, if you want things to sound tight and to be really cohesive, it just takes a long time, a lot of editing and working late at night and then going back the next day and just redoing everything you did. But that's just part of the process, I think, and I've just been enjoying it more and more, just steadily like chipping away at these tracks and not giving up on them after 5 or 10 hours, and just really seeing where I can get like past the 20-hour mark or the 30-hour mark even, and see what happens to a track if you really keep pushing through. One other thing I want to talk about with the drums is this ride pattern, and I've been using this ride on every single track I make at the moment, and it's really just solved the problem of using a ride in a track for me. And it's from this Bernard Purdie, who's a really famous drummer. And I've just taken a chop of one of his breaks, and I think it's in my sample pack somewhere, or in the free one. But it's great because it's just got a few different tones of rides, and it's nice and dusty, but I'm just layering this all the time. And I've created a pattern, and it's got lots of reverb, and it's sitting right at the back of the mix, but it fills out so much of that dead space in the drums. And you really notice it when it goes away, but you don't really hear it when it's there. And having those little fill elements in your drums, filling out the background of the space. You know, I've got my punchy drums in the foreground, and then sometimes you just want something sitting in the back as well. And you can achieve that with reverb on your main drums, but I quite like just having a ride layer right at the back that you can bring in, and it just gives you a bit of energy in your track. But one thing I do like to do with these rides is actually to follow my kick and snare pattern. I don't like just to have the rides on the quarter note or the eighth note just beating on the pulse. I think that works really well for house music, but in drum and bass it's quite nice to actually layer your ride pattern and to make a rhythm following your main kick snare pattern a little bit. And that's what I'm often doing here if I kind of show you these two. Okay, so let's quickly have a look at the bass in this track. Now, this bass took me ages to get right, and I still don't think it's perfect, but I really had to go, and what I would do is create a whole bass sequence, and then I wouldn't quite like it, and I'd actually just copy like a whole section over, and then just delete everything and leave the old one as it was, and just rework the bass and just go at it all over again and see what I could come up with. And eventually I found something that I quite liked. It consists mainly of resampling one noise. And I've taken a sample from the Digitone of like a fat Reese bass sound that I made, and I'm really just reprocessing it. Like, there's not that much happening on the channel. I've got a little bit of distortion happening. I've got a limiter, which is definitely doing a bit of saturation, and it's smashing it a little bit to keep it all level. And then I'm sending it all to a bass reverb as well, with the low end. If I go to the bass reverb channel here, this is the bass reverb, and I've cut all the low end out of the bass reverb channel. So it's sounding massive. Without that reverb, it doesn't sound nearly as cool. Gives it that space, especially when the hits drop, it has a nice space that it's living in. But anyway, with my bass lines, what I'm really doing is I'm using these in the modulation panel here. I'm using distortion fold and distortion shape, and those are actually the same distortions that are in this distortion plugin that you've just got access to in the modulation panel. And I'm really just modulating them all in different ways and just smashing the amount and the tone to give me really crispy fat distortion sounds. And I'm just reworking this sample over and over again. So I've got this is probably another version. This is the sub bass that's playing off. So that's another bass sound. But then if I go to this one, this is another resampled version where I've done more envelope shaping. I've done a little pitch hit to give me a bit of punch at the start of the sample, and it's got some LFO going on here as well. So it's always just taking that same bass noise and just reworking it with different modulation each time. So really the point of the bass here is to take one really long resampled bass and just to morph that with envelopes and modulation, and to create lots of variations just from one single source. But one thing is when you're modulating in this window, sometimes you've used up this parameter, and you might want to use a filter as well that's working in a triggered way. And you can do this in the track area, but here I've got lots of different tracks playing in this one strip, so I didn't want to have to create a whole new track with all these effects taking up lots of CPU. So what you can actually do is, if you come into the effects panel of the specific instrument, so this is the bass noise here, and what I'm actually doing is I've got a filter set up, and then I've got this key tracker set up, and by default, if you go and load key tracker, it'll have the min and the max at 100, but if you pull the max all the way down to nothing, and then I've just assigned it to the LFO and then to reset on the LFO, and what that's going to mean is that I can then create a one-shot LFO, and just the same way that I'm doing envelope shaping in here, I can actually just do very similar style envelope shaping in the effects panel by using key tracker assigned to the reset of an LFO. And you can watch here, I'm controlling the low pass filter amount on this sound. So with the sub bass, there's one really cool thing I want to show you, and that is actually this mute group and putting the sub bass on a mute group. And what it means is that when you trigger the next sub note, it's actually going to cut the previous one off. Now you can do this with mono, but the one thing about using this mute group is I can actually use in the volume, I can use release on my samples. I can use sustain and release, and then I'm still going to get the bass lines cutting off. And the easiest way for me to show you is actually just to show you both things and what's happening. So if I put mono on and I don't have this group on, if I trigger something a bit higher, you can see that the old note is still ringing out when I'm playing the new one. You're getting these overlapping bass sounds, and that's going to create loads of weird problems. Especially if I put a long release up. Can you hear it's like it's getting all the weird phasing and stuff happening. And I quite like being able to like hold the note with sustain and then release it and have a natural tail of the bass. So the trick to do that with is actually to put the bass on mute group 1, and now you can sustain and then you have your release. Yeah, the traditional way to program your bass would just be using decay and stretching the decay out, but I really like having sustain and release and then putting this mute group on group 1. It just gives me a much more natural sounding sub bass sound, and it's much more fun to play with your bass that way. Anyway, I think that's all for me today. I've really been all over in this project and using lots of different hardware and devices, and yeah, I'm quite happy with the song and the result, and I really enjoyed creating this Blade Runner theme and just running with it and seeing where it went. But it's been a really fun one for me, and I hope you've enjoyed it too. So yeah, that's all for me today. Peace.